So this talk is basically PrestoSQL, and it was inspired by essentially seeing blog posts and videos from the community on major companies like Uber, Twitter, and Pinterest. And every time I read it, it was like, oh, that's not really applicable to us being where I work, because it was talking about like exabytes of data and 10,000 servers. So
Hey Corey, before you get too far into it, don't forget to record.
oh, it is recording.
Oh, cool. I just didn't show it on my status of mine. Okay, just want to
Okay.
make sure.
Yep,
All
it should be recording.
right,
For
thanks.
forever, you are in the recording now. So yeah, it was essentially let's make it more small and mid-sized companies and relate. So I'm Corey Darby, and I come from a different background of many different companies, and honestly, pretty interested in big data. And right now, I work at Blue Cat. Um, So you might be asking yourself, what is Blue Cat? Because this talk relates to Blue Cat's journey with Presto. Um, so we're in this market called DDI, which is DNS, DHCP, and IPAM. And we have a mixture of on-premise products and cloud products. And, I want to just throw in some context that like the entire engineering department's about 100 employees. And since the day we start really using Presto, it's only been about 7 months. So Um, and for context, what the product is essentially kind of looks like this. We handle internal DNS requests, and we have basically these POPs DNS servers. You can call them micro DNS servers for simplistic sake, and they serve the request. Or we go to these larger DNS servers, and when it isn't cached on these micro DNS servers, and we resolve the DNS from there and send it back. So with this, we produce a bunch of data for security and operational teams, and also for our product to be able to analyze whether or not we think something is a threat or suspicious activity and whatnot. So now you get an idea of Blue Cat and what we're doing, and we have all this data with this product. Let's talk a little bit about Presto, because I wasn't sure how intro people would be, and so Presto is this high performance distributed SQL query engine. Common mistake is people think it's a database. It's not. It doesn't store the data itself. So essentially, the architecture of Presto is you have this coordinator. So you pass in the query, it parses it, and it creates this query plan. And then you have a worker, and the worker's job is essentially to go out, fetch the data, do the joins, aggregates, sorts, and return results. So this is your query execution part of it. And then it has connectors, which is, it's kind of the same concept of like a database driver. So it has support for like Kafka, Pulsar, S3. There's like 20 connectors. So with this, we essentially have Presto takes in a query from us and goes out to the worker and says, here's the plan you should execute, and go to your connectors to pull in that data. And then I want you to do whatever remaining you need to do. So a join or aggregate or sort. And when you're done all that, and you do it across multiple workers, and you aggregate, you funnel up basically, or across the workers really, I should say. And then this goes back out to the coordinator, and then you would get your results. So, you know, oh, so what it looks like is you get SQL, and this is a fictional example. And the syntax kind of cheats because there's no S3 um, connector. It would be called Hive, but let's not get into that. But you are able to do something like, I want to select from one connector being, say, S3, or one source being S3, and a whole other source being Elasticsearch. And then I want to be able to pull in that data and do a left join on, similar columns. And then I want to be able to apply this filtering clause, where fraud score is greater than 98% confidence. And I want to do aggregation by country. So essentially in this example, you'd be asking for some, like a company would be doing this to You might have one team who dumps out all their information into S3 for the customers, but then their research team might be in Elasticsearch only and have the models output into Elasticsearch. So now we have two different data sources. We could have written something in Flink to do this, but it's very powerful when you can sit a dev in front of it and you're like, look, SQL ANSI, like we're all familiar with this. Just write SQL, and behind the scenes, you don't care about anything. You don't care about one being S3 and one not. You're just specifying, yeah, go to this data source and go to this data source and pull in this data and let me basically do what I want. So our Presto setup at Blue Cat is in AWS Cloud. Um, we use the managed Kubernetes service there. So we run it in Kubernetes. We are using EKS on Amazon. We're using the stable Helm chart right now. We have some minor modifications, just like adding in some of properties that you can't inject. Helm is essentially like the NPM for Kubernetes if you're not familiar with Helm. And we run something called AWS Glue because with Presto, there's a meta store which stores information about the schemas. You don't need to use Glue. You could use the Hive meta store because we're already in AWS. We're using the Glue product. So how we're using it is essentially kind of falls into these spots. We're really focused on using Presto to abstract future changes and treating it for a single point of access and embracing the storage and compute separation because, well, we'll get into it. And we want to reduce vendor lock. So abstracting future change. So we're able to use these connectors that Presto provides us, so different connectors for different problems. So you might say, well, we have all our raw logs in S3, which is great when we want to pull in that data. But if we want to do something with, aggregates, and the hottest tool might be, I don't know, Cassandra or Pinto or Elasticsearch, or you pick whatever tool you think is best. And now we can say, okay, great. So we just add one more connector to Presto, and then we're able to use that. So it also makes it easy for us to reduce the burden of changing sources in the future because we're using Presto. Aside from the exceptions with some of the connectors, most of it is just the SQL ANSI that you're writing. So behind the scenes, I can kind of swap out the connectors for a different connector. So if we're sitting with S3, and then tomorrow we're like, we want to use, Cassandra or whatever, the SQL ANSI stays valid, assuming the connectors both support all the functionality and they work relatively the same. But it definitely reduces the burden of us switching out the connectors behind. So it's this layer of abstraction, right? And we're able to prolong choices that we don't need to happen today, which is really good because the most finite thing we have is our time. And, the problems we're tackling today are very much different from the problems we're going to be tackling in a year of use or the business's requirements in a year. So right now, Elasticsearch might work great for us. And in a year, when our data outgrows that or it becomes too much of an operational pain, we really want to be able to kind of switch and move over. So it just really allows this flexibility of like, great, so I can prolong that choice because I know it's not a huge burden to switch over the connectors. And I can prolong it because most of that SQL ANSI is going to be the same. So yeah, this is one of the reasons why we use it. And actually, I should just say that all this is applicable no matter the size. You know, uh, even at 100 employees, these are things that you're going to encounter. The business is going to evolve. The problems are going to evolve. Your data is most likely going to grow. So you kind of don't want to pigeonhole yourself into, well, I'm stuck with that thing that we chose when it was the right tool for the job. And when we looked at the space, it was the right tool for the job. But now, new kid on the block has come along and you're like, no, no one wants to use that thing anymore. Now we want to use that. So Presto really allows this middle abstraction where you're like, ah, I don't care because it's just a different connector. So we just need to swap out the connector and put in a different connector. Plus, everyone's familiar with the Presto system at that point, so it becomes a lot easier. Um, Single point of access. So one of the nice things is you have these proof of concepts, these POCs, and one of the first things you do is, well, that's great. A team has worked on it, but now no one can use it because it's writing to somewhere else, or it's doing something else, or it's using a new technology that no one else in the company is familiar with. So either, let's say it's using Cassandra, no one else in the company is using Cassandra, but this was the right tool for it. Um, so you could either use the connector in Presto for Cassandra, and you would have access to this, or it's very easy just to tell everyone in your company, like in our case, because we're not AWS, just ship it to S3. Just ship your results or the end byproduct that I care about to S3. Um, because most teams already have this for log retention and the policies are already there. And most of us are familiar with the file system. So it's very easy to just go, no problem. And even in starting points, you could just start in the sense of, uh, okay, you're not going to get the real feeds, but every day, what we're going to do is at the end of the day, we're just going to dump you basically, you know, a database dump into S3, and then you'll have the daily. And that's a good starting point, right? Because, it's going to take you time to transition and have everything go over and whatnot. So, um, also, once you have the single point of kind of access concept, you get all these other additional enhancements either upfront if you're spending the time or down the road. So if I know that everyone is going through something like Presto to pull in their data or cross join on data, all of a sudden I have the central spot where I can throw in things like, well, I want to audit and make sure permissions are enforced and logging. So, um, I don't know, let's say you're an HR company, or a bad example maybe of a bank company. It's like you don't want Bob to come in and just be like, well, I just left join on that table and I can see what everyone makes in the bank or what everyone's accounts are. Um, Obviously your bank, you have those policies in place, but smaller companies, not always. It's kind of just be like, yeah, well, everyone kind of has broad access to the AWS account, and you know, um, but at least here you kind of get some insight. It's also good just for application to application. I want to know who's consuming all the DB resources or the XYZ, or at least it's a spot to go versus before it's like, well, I have to check every application that has access to use that. Um, and the great thing is when you have this central spot, you get this optimization that can impact the entire organization. So I know if we're all going through Presto and a new connector comes out that makes an improvement with XYZ, that everyone in the company, once we upgrade the Presto cluster, would get that benefit. Versus before, you'd have to go to each team and be like, yo, you need to upgrade XYZ, or you need to be running a newer version of that JDBC driver, or you need to, like, oh, you're using the library that's super old that doesn't do the, I don't know, async query on whatever. Here, it's like, great. Um, if I can do it on the Presto side, everyone kind of benefits. And so this is good. um, Kind of raises the expectations of each team. So, you know, before it's like, well, that team went off and did something, and now I don't know what they really did. Now you start getting the scenarios where it's like, well, I expect to be able to go in and just have access to the data and be able to just run queries against it at will. So, other things that we kind of went on this journey, which was embracing storage and compute separation. So it's nice to have them scale independent. And the advantages are that we can pick which one we want, like S3, we're on the cloud, so that's very good on the storage. And we just want the compute of, the best instances of Amazon on that side. Versus, if it's bundled and I have to pick between, well, I have to run these, I don't know, disk plus CPU kind of ratio EC2 instances, I guess the i3s with the SSDs or something, for the persistence and whatnot and the compute, then you're kind of stuck. So we like to be able to scale independent. And yeah, because we like to take advantage of each different instance type. And also you have this nice approach of tiered storage. And what I mean here is essentially, you know, data that's accessed infrequently, we would like to move it elsewhere and not have to worry about it. And well, at Amazon, this is very easy with S3. So we can just set a policy, and after 30 days, we'll just move it and we like to pay less. Versus if it's on an EC2 instance and you're using like elastic block storage, or you've got an NVMe SSD, you don't have this. And the other problem would be you would have to write it now for the connector, or I guess two schemas in Presto for it to know that, okay, there's data I persist on just myself, and the tiered storage is on S3. And now I always need to, I guess, join the persisted data with the long-term storage table, which would kind of suck. So, so we also look at it for reducing vendor lock. So, all open stuff. The big kite right now is Snowflake, but this is just vendor lock. Snowflake is essentially big push is everything should live in Snowflake and nothing else should be anywhere else, which is great if you're bought 100% into Snowflake. But last place I was at, we went down this path with Vertica, and it was just a nightmare. And anyways, so and basically my philosophy behind this is the data should reside where it's best suited. And because Presto doesn't actually hold on to that data itself, it's just the middleman. It just takes the query you give it, plans it, and then the workers go out and fetch it from wherever the data resides. Then we're able to look at tools that are best suited when versus one giant tool to rule them all, I guess. So let's talk about some real stories. So one thing we did was this S3 compactor POC. So because we use Presto and reads from S3, we don't want these very tiny files because it has to make all these API calls to get them. So we had a good idea that this was kind of a bad performance scenario for us, but we are actually able to use Presto itself to just select all our data from S3 and rewrite into S3 in a different bucket. And because the workers and the amount of workers we're reading, we ended up taking like, let's say 100 files down to 5 files. Um, and it wasn't an actual product or an application that we still run, but it was enough for us to actually very quickly, in the span of like 10 minutes, have a POC to actually have all these files moved from these like 100 KB files to like, even 10 megs, and rerun the test. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, that is the problem. Like query performance went up by like, 80%. And for anyone who's done anything with this knows that like even 10 megs is not enough. These files should be like, ideally 100 meg to 1 gig. But this was a very easy 10-minute, you know, uh, select all from well, insert into new bucket, select all from current bucket, and that was it. So we had all the data just shift into the other bucket with larger files. Um, so we had another thing where we were joining raw data. So, you know, we had a team that went off and built some stuff that was related to what they were working on, and it was a part of a event stream. So we have, let's say, a bunch of data come into the event stream, and they run some analysis on it, and then they make an output decision, and they might store, say, like some partial columns from that into it. So they might store like a key and a date, and they've scored something. So let's say it's like some machine learning model, and it comes out with a score to the data we've given it. And then they persist this somewhere else in like S3 because that's their results. That's what they care about. But now when you want to look at something like, oh, those results you got and stored at the end, I want to see the raw records because I actually want to investigate further. And you could manually do this, which we originally were. And then it's like, wait, I can just join. Like, why don't I just join your files with the raw results that we persist into S3 eventually? And instantly you just have this team that was off doing something now have access to the raw data as well. Um, and I thought this was kind of magical because a lot of times we work at these, even the mid-sized companies, you get a lot of different silo teams, and you go and ask, you're like, we'd be such a better company if I just had access to blah. and you go and ask that team and they're like, yeah, yeah, but we're gonna have to write this custom job and we're gonna have to push the data somewhere and someone's got to do that. And there's no buy-in because product has other features they want. And for us, it was really nice just being like, oh, wait, the data is already there. We already have Presto. In this case, they happen to both be using the same connector, but they could be using different connectors. And it was just like, well, we have keys on both sides that we're using. So why don't we just join? And you could say, well, why don't you just do that? Like if, let's just say it was a MySQL database, and well, why don't you just access MySQL database and just join and pull the data that way, or pull the data into your database? But anyone who's even worked in a mid-sized company knows that teams are very protective of that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, just to get access to that database, it's like, okay, I need to open up a ticket. Someone's going to have to make it, and it's always in the backlog. So this is really nice. Um, and the other thing is we had this ad hocing research or searching ability. So it was nice being able to sit there and very quickly not needing to necessarily write a Flink job or write something, go over our streams or pull all the data into our streams, but very quickly just saying, okay, all the data we've persisted, I want to look if anything matches anything. Let's say um, we had a DNS query that looked like google.com, but it looked suspicious because it was from, I don't know, a space that it shouldn't have come from. Did that happen anywhere else in the logs? And where did that happen? And how did it happen? And then we have the raw logs too, right? And then I can do fancier things where it's like, oh, that other team that was doing the modeling, can I join that back and see that did they miss something with their model or et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's a very powerful tool once you have it in place. And it kind of feels a little bit magical because even now internally, every time, easy example was like, I want to write a script that tracked our spending by user. And I basically wrote this little API call thing to a service we use, and it says who created it and the hourly price, and it's a ton of records. And I'm like, man, I know I could write the Python stuff to just iterate over and put it all in this nice list and have it by person and the total spend. But I'm like, if I do that, someone's always going to come and bug me because they want XYZ. Not only do I want the person or price, I also want to know what was the AWS service they spun up. And then I want to group by the category of AWS service and always this stuff, right? People like to be able to filter and manipulate the data. I think this is what has helped something like Excel explode because you're just like export, put in Excel, do whatever you want. But this was nice because I actually sat there and was like, this is a really good scenario for me to just write out the results um, and put it into S3 and just use Presto to just come in and write SQL. And, you know, so this was just a unintended spot where I found myself using Presto for it. Um, so some of the stuff that kind of where we're going, okay, this transitions were all messed up, but anyways, was, and I guess what I should talk about more is these small and medium companies, you have to think about how do you join information across your product lines. Like we have two very distinct product lines where I work. And one of the big things is it's essentially two larger teams in the company that are working on product A and product B. And you're stuck in this middle spot of going, yeah, but I want to have the information you have on my side and the information I have on your side. And trying to introduce code into each side to do this is just, takes up this finite resource of development time versus now it's just kind of easier for me to come in and be like, where are you storing your data now? Um, and a lot of times it's usually like, oh, there's either a snapshot that gets stored somewhere or someone's storing raw logs somewhere. And in which case it's like, great, either we write the connector or if the connector exists in the open source community, we can use it. And then team A is able to access team B's information. Um, the other thing that is kind of unique here is you start considering scenarios where you're like, oh, let's say I run Kafka and then I have some persistent layer. And you always get stuck kind of in the spot of, okay, yeah, but how do I, the searchability is usually on the stuff that's persisted somewhere. And yeah, but that's not up to date because the pipeline has data moving in it. Well, for Presto, it's like, well, I just have a connector that connects to the real time Kafka and the persistent, S3 or wherever you're putting it. And I can just join. And if you're worried about eventual consistency, you could add distinct and remove keys that are duplicates across both and stuff like this. But a lot of times we don't even think about this. We think like, the real-time stream isn't for user ad hoc search. It's just whatever we persist and you just wait until the data gets pushed in. Um, the other thing is you find like even that spending project I was talking about, you find yourself using or considering using Presto for these really unique scenarios. So one of the things that we had talked about was, well, don't we want our data that goes to say these machine learning models to persist longer or for a longer retention? So that if they want to have some, if they write a new model or they want to experiment, there's like 4 days worth of test data or 30 days or some amount. But this increases how much your event pipeline is going to be because now every time you have a team, they're going to ask for the same thing. We would like some X hours or X days of data so that we could always test our jobs or something. And ideally, you want it to be nothing, which is you get nothing. I send a message in, you acknowledge it, the pipeline deletes it, and we move on. But Presto is really good for being able to just be like, well, why don't I just select everything from S3 and just insert back into Kafka on their topic? And all of a sudden, or even the team itself is empowered to do this, where they might have a new iteration of model and they're like, well, I want to see how this would perform on historical 30 days of data, but I don't want to write this one-off Python script that reads this and pulls it in. It's no problem. It's just SQL. Select all from blah blah blah, and where your date range is whatever. Assume you have or whatever your date columns may be, and you insert it back into Kafka or Pulsar or whatever it may be, and now all of a sudden your model has 30 days of data. You can even consider DR scenarios, like God forbid my Kafka stuff blows up and we can't, like, I don't know, all the data's gone and I want to restore. And everyone always says that they're going to write a tool to do this. Like, oh yeah, yeah, we'll put it part of the DR plan. We'll have some restore Python or Java application that reads and pulls back in. But with Presto, I just know I'm able to go, okay, well, I would just select everything else that used to be there. And you might be concerned because there could be duplicates because you don't know where the stream was and stuff like that. But this is just part of your DR plan. Um, and you could just select from wherever was persisted and just reinsert back in. So yeah, I find myself using it for a bunch of unique scenarios. And I think a lot of companies think that I have to be Uber or Pinterest to do this. We had some got yous. Um, a couple of things was like, if you do go to use this, there's a flag for load balancers that you need to turn on, which is, I think, documented now. But at the time, I had to ask in the Slack Presto community channel. There's a lot of competing Presto load balancers right now. There's no official one. So there's like a Uber, Twitter, and Pinterest, I think, has their own. If you want to run 2 Presto clusters and things like this. Uh, so the Kubernetes and Helm experience, honestly, it was pretty straightforward. Like we Helm installed it and we're on our way. The other things though is the stable Helm charts are, if anyone uses them, knows that they're really slow for change. So there's like 3 pull requests for Presto related stuff that we wanted, and it's just been sitting there for like 6 months. So it's nothing against Presto or this community. It's just the Helm stable charts just take forever for change. And there's no Horizon pod autoscale built in the Helm chart, so you would have to do this yourself, or you just over provision your cluster, whatever. I mean, pick your whatever works for you. So metrics, one thing that we weren't thrilled about was we had to use the JMX exporter on Prometheus to actually pull the metrics in. And when we looked at it, it was a little confusing because you can call the coordinator or the worker on the JMX ports and you get metrics, but some of the metrics you ask yourself, you're like, yeah, but is this memory usage field just what this worker knows about and is running, or is this the cluster-wide metrics of everything running across? So this just took time of reading. And then the authenticator, which is the highest, because one of the things that we want to do is we want to inject our own custom JWT authenticator. So you probably won't have this issue. But the authenticator highest class, I don't even remember what it's called, but this itself is not a part of their SPI. So you can't just override this. They do have a bunch that you can go and change. Like the password one is there. I think there's like I think there's 3 in there. There are a couple that are there that you can just go in and, hey, I want to write my own Java code and do whatever and have it use that. Okay, great. But the JWT authenticator is not there. And the upper authenticator class, you can't just say, I want to override the whole class and just do my own thing entirely. But there's GitHub issue for every single one of these, except for the load balancer one, because this is part of, there's a GitHub issue for the docs here, but the competing one is you just have to do your research and kind of pick which one you want. So I know this says the end, but I kind of realized I didn't really fully answer I didn't fully answer everything, which was, it took us essentially, if today you want to use Presto as a POC in your company, the Helm charts are literally just Helm install PrestoSQL, or just Presto, I think it's called there. And you have your worker and coordinators up. The rest is a configuration file to specify what connector you want. It's like 3 or 4 fields I think you put in there, and you're off to races. So the benefit of something like this is kind of what I was trying to allude to, is you get a lot of versatility on having something that's this single point of access that you can just write SQL. And I think a lot of times we go, oh, this tool is going to take like, 4 or 5 ops people, and it's going to have to take all this crazy expertise. But to be quite frank, we've mostly treated it as a black box. Like, it does what it needs to do, and we don't ask a lot of questions about it. So this has been good. And then, why you would even want to consider doing this is, I just think that there's a lot of value in companies being able to leverage data across departments that just gets pushed off because team A doesn't have the capacity, or team B thinks it's going to be too much work, or no one's sure how to approach it, or the company is so scattered with different technologies. So yeah, that's kind of my thing. You don't have to be exabyte scale and 10,000 nodes, or a DevOps department of even 5 for this. It's really something that you could start out your company in a hackathon or POC and start to push the value even that way. And yeah, a weekend you would be able to do something quite interesting with this. So that is the end of my talk. So if you have questions or any comments, just unmute yourself and
I just want to say good job, Corey. Thanks for the presentation. This is good stuff, especially like this is a message that not a lot of people are pushing in the Presto community. So I'm glad that you took the initiative too. So thank you.
Corey, I have a question. I work with Corey, just for background, but just if you're basically managing your own Presto versus using AWS managed Athena, like what would the big trade-offs be there? Because obviously Athena is easier to get set up with, but what would you say the trade-offs are?
well, I guess my thing would be the fact that, Athena is Amazon's kind of fork of it. And it's actually, theirs is the fork of PrestoDB, but that's a whole other context scenario, which is like in the community, there used to be PrestoDB, now there's PrestoSQL. Like PrestoSQL is all you care about. But you could use the Amazon Athena one For us, it was essentially just the cost, because it's not a predictable cost and you pay per query. Versus us, it was like, I would rather the predictable cost of, we know we have to have XYZ infrastructure and we know what our max kind of spend will be, right? And we're willing to trade on the query response time. So the query might take longer, or the query might be in queue longer in order to cap our spend. But with Athena, it's, I submit query and it's just going to execute and it's going to come back as fast as the query can. And I don't have any real control of the spend. So, if you have a internal facing tool only, then Athena might work as a good stepping stone. But once you start exposing this out to the customer and you have unpredictable traffic, right? Because the user could go in today and just 40 queries, refresh, refresh, refresh. And every time that is, I spend. So I think that's a good answer.
So you're saying for like a very quick POC or like hackathon type thing, Athena might be suitable, but for something that's going to be hitting production, you want something where you've got better control over the costs.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of, I guess, a good point, because if you're already on Amazon, Athena is just a couple clicks and you're good to go. As well as it sets up the Glue meta store for you, so you're not even aware of that. And then you could do your POCs with this, and then you could just, if it becomes too expensive, and this is a cost consideration in your company, then you could definitely just go over and say, okay, it's probably about time we start looking at something like running Presto ourselves versus always paying for Athena and whatnot.
There's also another like aspect to it too, is like, if you're wanting to be a little more like cloud agnostic, if you're maybe partially on AWS and partially on, I don't know, Microsoft or Google's cloud platform, a lot of people are on Amazon, so maybe that is a perfectly fine solution. But this, the same way that we want to kind of try to avoid vendor lock-in, you may, you're getting Presto, but you're kind of still kind of getting yourself stuck into the AWS ecosphere. So it's that's just one other point, depending on your use cases and your requirements. So
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. I mean, if you're already, like, for us, we're already so bought in that is like, Athena would be perfect for our POC, and we had used Athena before, as Giles knows. So yeah. All right. There are no other questions. I guess we will just call it. I will link up the recording in the meetup group if you came later or early and you had to leave. Well, if you're early and you left, you wouldn't even know there's gonna be a recording link. So it is what it is. But yeah.
thank you very much, Corey.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for everyone who came. See ya.